In the heart of Paris in the year 1894, as the golden leaves of autumn fell across the boulevards, a storm was quietly gathering that would challenge the soul of the French Republic. The streets were filled with tension left behind by the wounds of the Franco-Prussian War, and as national pride struggled to recover, suspicion and division found new life in the whispers of treason. The name at the center of it all was Alfred Dreyfus, a promising artillery officer born in Alsace. To a Jewish family, and devoted to the ideals of France, he had climbed the ranks through merit, a rare achievement in a military still dominated by old prejudices. Tall, precise, and quiet, he lived and breathed the army, but to many around him, he would never truly belong because of one fact: he was Jewish. In an army poisoned by antisemitism, that fact was enough to turn loyalty into suspicion and excellence into accusation. It was in this charged environment that the French intelligence service intercepted a torn handwritten note, later known as the bordereau discovered in the German embassy. Trash, it contained military secrets. Someone inside the French military was betraying the nation, and an example had to be made quickly: the general. Staff wanted to show strength and resolve, and Dreyfus became the convenient target summoned to the Ministry of War under the guise of a meeting. Dreyfus was arrested on October 15th and questioned without a lawyer, isolated and unaware of. The evidence against him, handwriting experts were brought in and under pressure to produce results. They claimed the writing matched Dreyfus, though in truth the resemblance was flimsy, and their conclusions would later be discredited. The military held a secret trial, barring even Dreyfus's defense team from seeing the full file, which included forged documents designed to strengthen the case against him. This miscarriage of justice culminated in December when a closed military court declared him guilty of high treason, sentencing him to life imprisonment on Devil's Island, a tiny strip of land off the coast of French Guiana, known for its savage conditions. The reaction in France was explosive. Many newspapers celebrated the verdict, particularly the virulently anti-Semitic publications that painted Dreyfus as part of a wider Jewish conspiracy. The Catholic Church, the army, and much of the conservative elite applauded the decision, viewing it as a triumph of national defense over internal enemies. But among the few who watched with quiet horror was Dreyfus's devoted wife, Lucy. She refused to believe that her husband of honor and discipline could be guilty of such betrayal, and she began writing letters to politicians, military leaders, and journalists, pleading for anyone to look deeper into the case. Dreyfus himself remained composed, insisting on his innocence even during the infamous public degradation ceremony on January 5, 1895. At the École Militaire in Paris, in front of a jeering crowd of thousands, Dreyfus was marched into the courtyard, his epaulettes torn, his sword snapped over the knee of an officer as he shouted, "I am innocent, long live France!" The crowd roared with hatred, some spitting, others chanting death to the Jew. In that moment, Dreyfus became a symbol not just of a man betrayed by his country, but of a nation willing to sacrifice justice for the illusion of unity. He was transported by ship across the mid-Atlantic to Devil's Island, where he was placed in solitary confinement in a stone cell, under constant surveillance, forbidden to speak to guards, subjected to the pounding sun and relentless rain. Lucy's letters were heavily censored and arrived months late, if at all. But still she wrote every day, refusing to let him disappear from memory. While France tried to move on, swept up in nationalist fervor, one man within the military began to notice inconsistencies. Colonel Georges Picquart, newly appointed as head of military intelligence, had no reason to doubt the conviction at first, but as he examined the secret dossier and compared the bordereau to letters written by another officer, Ferdinand Walson Esterhazy, he became convinced that the real traitor was Esterhazy, not Dreyfus. Picquart brought his findings to his superiors expecting gratitude, but was instead warned to keep quiet and eventually reassigned to a remote post in Tunisia. The army wanted no reopening of the case, and certainly no public scandal. Picquart's conscience, however, would not allow him to remain silent, and he began leaking information to trusted friends back in France. Small circles of intellectuals, journalists, and politicians were beginning to stir. Emile Zola, one of France's most famous writers, would become the voice of that movement in the years ahead. But in 1896, it was still dangerous to speak out against the army, the government, and the church. To defend Dreyfus was to invite social exile threats, and worse, the press largely aligned against him. The people had been fed a story, and they believed it. The traitor had been punished, the military had restored honor. But beneath the surface, France was dividing, along lines that would define its future: nationalists versus Republicans, conservatives versus progressives, antisemites versus defenders of equality. As whispers turned to murmurs and murmurs to protests, the Dreyfus affair was far from over. It had only just begun, and the struggle for truth would soon explode into a national crisis that threatened to tear the country apart, exposing not only a broken system, but the courage of those who dared to stand against it in defense of a man who had already lost everything but his dignity and his unshakable faith in justice. By the year 1896, as Captain Alfred Dreyfus suffered in silence on the wind-swept hell of Devil's Island, far across the ocean in France, the first cracks in the official story began to show. Colonel Georges Picquart, a man of honor and by no means a friend of Dreyfus, had stumbled upon disturbing evidence while leading the Army's intelligence unit. As he sifted through communications between foreign agents, he noticed that the real traitor was not Dreyfus, but a far more suspicious figure, Major Ferdinand Walsin Esterhazy, whose handwriting matched the original bordereau far more convincingly than Dreyfus ever had. Picquart initially believed this discovery would bring relief to the army, that truth would be embraced, but the reaction was the opposite. He was told to bury the evidence and forget what he had seen, and when he persisted, he was exiled to a distant North African outpost under dubious pretenses. Despite this silencing, Picquart's conscience had been stirred, and the files he shared began circulating quietly among France's intellectual elite, one of whom would change the course of history. Emile Zola, already one of the most revered writers in France, was outraged by what he saw, not just the injustice toward Dreyfus, but the systemic rot it revealed in the nation's most trusted institutions. After much deliberation, Zola published a scathing open letter, titled J'accuse, in the newspaper L'Aurore on January 13, 1898, directly accusing the military high command of obstruction of justice and wrongful conviction. The letter was a bombshell across the nation. People rushed to read the words that dared to speak what many feared to whisper. Zola had not only named names, but stood openly against the powerful, with a pen as his only weapon. The backlash was immediate. The government charged him with criminal libel, and mobs demanded his imprisonment. But Zola's words had awakened something in the French soul, a conflict of identity that could no longer be ignored. In salons, in cafes, in homes, the public began taking sides. The Dreyfusards, who supported reopening the case, framed their fight as one of reason, liberty, and justice, while the anti-Dreyfusards saw the whole affair as an attack on the army, the church, and national pride. Anti-Semitic rhetoric increased in newspapers and public rallies, painting the case as a Jewish plot to undermine France. And yet, despite the risk, more voices joined Zola's side, among them future Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, who used his editorial platform to demand truth and accountability in response to public pressure. The military held a court-martial for Esterhazy in January 1898, but the trial was a sham, lasting only 2 days, and resulting in a swift acquittal, after which Esterhazy fled to England in disgrace, though officially exonerated. The farce further eroded public trust and emboldened the Dreyfusard movement. Now galvanized by the obvious miscarriage of justice, Zola was convicted of libel and sentenced to a year in prison, but fled to England rather than serve the sentence. Even in exile, he remained defiant and unwavering. His sacrifice had forced the government to confront a crisis it could no longer suppress. Meanwhile, Lucy Dreyfus continued her tireless campaign, writing to anyone who would listen and maintaining hope that her husband might one day return home and clear his name. Public demonstrations grew increasingly passionate, and violent newspapers became battlegrounds of ideology. France was now split in two, not just over a man, but over the soul of the republic itself, while the army and the church tried to preserve their authority. The Dreyfusards insisted that no institution stood above the law and that justice must be served regardless of the consequences. In September 1898, as the affair reached a boiling point, a new piece of shocking news broke. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Henry, the officer responsible for forging key evidence in the Dreyfus file, confessed to his crime and committed suicide in his cell. The confession sent shockwaves through the nation and proved what many had feared. Dreyfus had been condemned not by justice, but by lies and hatred. The army tried to limit the damage, claiming Henry had acted alone, but the stain could not be erased. The confession shattered any illusion of infallibility within the military and forced the government to reconsider the case under immense pressure, and with the Republic threatened by unrest, the Court of Cassation, France's highest judicial body, opened an official review in early 1899. The tide had begun to turn, but the path to justice remained steep and perilous. The damage done to Dreyfus, his family, and to the nation would not be undone easily. For now the truth had been unearthed, and the battle had entered a new phase, one not fought in secrecy or silence, but in the full glare of public scrutiny, where every argument, every demonstration, and every act of courage would determine whether France could live up to the ideals etched into its national motto: liberty, equality, fraternity. As the 19th century neared its end, and the truth about the Dreyfus affair gained momentum, the French Republic faced an unprecedented test of conscience and character. In June of 1899, Alfred Dreyfus was brought back from Devil's Island, where he had endured nearly 5 years of isolation, physical decay, and psychological torment. His once firm posture had withered. His health was broken, but his mind remained sharp and unwavering in his claim of innocence, despite the horrifying conditions and mental torture. He had not confessed, he had not begged. He had only waited, trusting in the distant promise of justice as he set foot on French soil. Once again, the eyes of a divided nation followed every step of his return. He was to be retried not by the same secretive tribunal, but by a military court in Rennes, which, despite the exposed fabrications and public outcry, still held the fate of a wronged man in its hands. The retrial became a national spectacle. Journalists from around the world gathered in Rennes as every word, every testimony, and every whisper in the courtroom fed the political and moral firestorm consuming France. The government, wary of further inflaming the fragile balance of power, sought a quiet resolution and quietly hoped the retrial would reaffirm the military's dignity, even if it meant sacrificing the truth again. Dreyfus's legal team, led by passionate and brilliant advocates, laid bare the inconsistencies and the forged documents. They exposed Colonel Henry's suicide as a guilty confession and pointed directly to Major Esterhazy as the true traitor. Yet despite the mountain of evidence, the hostile courtroom, the prejudice of the panel, and the lingering anti-Semitic sentiments, all conspired to once again deny full justice. And in a shocking decision, the court found Dreyfus guilty, but with extenuating circumstances, and sentenced him to 10 more years of imprisonment. The verdict stunned the world, intellectuals, journalists. Foreign observers and the general public reacted with disbelief and rage. How could a man proven innocent still be punished? How could the Republic, founded on liberty and equality, justify such cowardice amid the fury President Emile Zola under immense domestic and international pressure, and desperate to preserve the credibility of the Republic, offered Dreyfus a pardon, not a declaration of innocence, but a political compromise meant to end the national crisis. Dreyfus, after years of unimaginable suffering, accepted not out of agreement but out of necessity. His health was failing and his family was exhausted. He returned to civilian life, a broken man, his name still legally stained and justice still out of reach. The pardon divided even the Dreyfusard, some believed it was a necessary step, others called it a betrayal of principle. But what remained undeniable was that Dreyfus had become more than a man. He was a symbol of resistance against institutional corruption, against prejudice, and against the perils of silence in the face of injustice. The battle was not over. Public opinion remained inflamed, and reformers pushed for full exoneration while nationalists and conservatives clung to the idea of military infallibility. As the 20th century dawned, France entered a period of intense political realignment, shaped in part by the passions stirred during the affair, the rise of the press as a political force, the involvement of intellectuals in public life, and the sharpening of the divide between secular Republicans and religious conservatives. All owed some debt to the drama that unfolded over the fate of one Jewish captain in the summer of 1906, the final chapter of Dreyfus's legal ordeal was written when the Court of Cassation formally annulled the previous convictions and declared Alfred Dreyfus innocent of all charges. The decision was greeted with applause and sorrow, with celebration and bitterness. For some, it was the restoration of truth. For others, it was the final proof that their institutions could no longer be trusted. Dreyfus was reinstated into the army, promoted to major, and awarded the Legion of Honor, though his physical and emotional wounds would never fully heal. The ceremony that marked his return to military service was quiet and solemn, far from the crowds that had once screamed for his disgrace. Yet it held a deeper meaning, not just for Dreyfus, but for all who had stood by him in the face of hatred and injustice. The affair had left its scars on France, but it had also illuminated its strengths: the power of free speech, the role of the judiciary, the courage of individuals like Zola Picard, Lucy Dreyfus, and thousands of anonymous supporters who refused to let lies become history. As Dreyfus stood once more in uniform under the French flag, he did so not as a soldier seeking revenge, but as a citizen, reminding his country of what it must always strive to be. Even after Alfred Dreyfus was officially exonerated in 1906, the legacy of the affair continued to reverberate through every institution of French society. The long fight for justice had exposed the deepest cracks in the foundation of the Republic, leaving behind a mixture of progress, regret, and unresolved tensions. Though Dreyfus had been reinstated into the military and awarded honors, his personal life was forever altered. Years of isolation, illness, and defamation had left both physical and emotional scars. While he attempted to live quietly with his wife Lucy and their children far from the public eye, his name continued to symbolize the epic struggle between truth and falsehood, between equality and prejudice. The political landscape in France had also shifted dramatically. The Dreyfus affair had given rise to the intellectual class as a potent political force. Figures like Emile Zola, who had risked everything to speak out, now stood as icons of moral courage. Journalists, editors, and writers became defenders of justice, shaping public opinion and demanding accountability from powerful institutions. The army, long viewed as the protector of French honor, emerged bruised and discredited, its prestige tarnished by the exposure of cover-ups, forgeries, and unlawful trials. Many of its senior officers were forced into retirement or resigned in disgrace. The Catholic Church, too, had suffered reputational damage for aligning itself with the anti-Dreyfusard factions and reinforcing the anti-Semitic rhetoric that permeated the press and pulpit alike. This shift in sentiment fueled the passage of new laws separating church and state, culminating in the landmark legislation of 1905, which officially secularized the French government. In many ways, the Dreyfus affair accelerated the Republic's commitment to laïcité and redefined what it meant to be a French citizen. No longer was loyalty to the army or the church the sole measure of patriotism. Instead, the ideals of justice, liberty, and reason began to take their place in the national conscience. Yet not all wounds healed easily for years to come. Violent protests, clashes, and political debates would erupt over the affairs. memory, with each side trying to shape the historical narrative. The far right sought to portray Dreyfus as a manipulative agent backed by shadowy forces refusing to accept his innocence, while the far left held him as a martyr of the peoples. Struggle against oppression in this polarized environment. Antisemitism remained a lingering menace, emboldened by the same populist forces that had once demanded Dreyfus's conviction. Some nationalist groups blamed Jews for the affair's upheaval and began to weave conspiracy theories that would later echo in darker chapters of European history despite these threats. Dreyfus himself refused to become a political figure. He never gave public speeches, never campaigned for office, and declined to be used as a symbol by any one party. His focus remained on his family and on rebuilding the life that had been unjustly stolen from him. Quietly, he continued to serve in the military during World War I, where, despite his age, he returned to duty as a colonel working behind the lines in logistics and supply. His service was not celebrated widely, nor was it hidden. It simply became another chapter in a life marked by silent endurance and principled resilience. In 1923, at the age of 64, Alfred Dreyfus died in Paris surrounded by his family. The news of his passing was met with solemn reflection across the country. For many, he had come to represent the triumph of the human spirit over institutional injustice, and his name was now permanently etched into the history books, not as a traitor, but as a victim of prejudice whose perseverance had sparked a national reckoning. His funeral, attended by both supporters and former critics, symbolized a quiet closure to one of the most divisive eras in modern French history. Though his voice had been suppressed for so long, the truth had at last spoken and been heard. Long after Alfred Dreyfus was laid to rest, the legacy of his ordeal continued to shape France's understanding of justice, identity, and democratic values. The Dreyfus affair had not only altered the course of one man's life, but had also redrawn the moral map of an entire nation. Its impact echoed through the chambers of government, the halls of academia, the pulpits of churches, and the press rooms of Europe's most powerful publications. It taught France that no institution was above accountability, and that the defense of truth often required personal sacrifice. As the 20th century unfolded, new generations of leaders, scholars, and activists revisited the affair not just as a historical episode, but as a foundational lesson in civic responsibility. The affair became a case study in military overreach, political cowardice, and the corrosive effects of unchecked prejudice and misinformation in schools and universities. The story of Dreyfus was taught as a cautionary tale about the fragility of justice in times of fear and the importance of due process in protecting the innocent. Museums hosted exhibitions, newspapers republished Zola's famous J'accuse letter, and filmmakers retold the story through documentaries and dramas, keeping the memory alive in the public imagination. Perhaps most significantly, the Dreyfus affair served as a warning of how easily democratic societies could descend into mob rule when stirred by bigotry and nationalism. Historians and legal scholars cited the affair as one of the earliest examples of modern human rights advocacy, as it galvanized public opinion across class, religious, and political lines, creating alliances between secularists, socialists, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens, all united in the pursuit of truth, even in the face of threats and repression decades. Later, during the rise of fascism in Europe, the ghosts of the Dreyfus affair returned once more as anti-Semitic ideologies gained ground in Germany, Italy, and even within France itself. Some feared that the lessons learned during the affair were being forgotten. Yet there remained a generation of French citizens who remembered what had happened and understood what was at stake. Inspired by the courage of those who had defended Dreyfus, many stood up against tyranny in the years leading to World War II, risking their lives to protect those targeted by hate. The Dreyfus affair also influenced the development of international human rights movements, providing a framework for how public intellectuals and civil society could act as watchdogs against state abuse. It contributed to the growth of investigative journalism and inspired the creation of organizations devoted to protecting the falsely accused and promoting judicial transparency. Monuments to Dreyfus were erected, in various parts of France, and his name came to represent both the suffering of the innocent and the redemptive power of truth in a world where justice was often a distant hope. Over a century later, the Dreyfus affair remains one of the most studied and debated episodes in French history because it reveals so much about the tensions that continue to challenge societies everywhere. The balance between national security and individual rights, the dangers of scapegoating minorities, the role of media in shaping public opinion, and the moral obligation of citizens to speak out, even when doing so comes at great cost. Today, Alfred Dreyfus is remembered not for the accusations that nearly destroyed him, but for the courage with which he endured them, and for the awakening his suffering triggered across a nation struggling to define itself between tradition and progress, between fear and fairness, between silence and truth. His story stands as a testament to the idea that justice is never given freely. It must be fought for again and again by those who believe in its promise and who refuse to let the voices of hatred drown out the quiet, persistent call of what is right.